Questions of Force 2. Spliff was allowed entrance by a servant into the sunny living area of Haida and Keppo's home. Neither was there, so he had a moment with his thoughts. In his pocket was one of the pamphlets, folded over carefully. He had been nervous to see his sister and old ex-friend again. Reasonably so, considering Keppo had tried to kill him last time they'd talked. But Spliff didn't think any real danger was imminent. Keppo wouldn't attack him in front of his children. Spliff had, however, by recommendation of Francis, taken a spoonful of tonic made from wild lettuce to help relax his muscles. Anxiety primarily resided in the muscle tissue, Francis said. When your muscles relax, your head will understand. Spliff wondered what Keppo's housing would have looked like without a family, but having stumbled into the same influence and power. That is, he wondered if Keppo had any actual taste, would make any choice which wasn't some confluence of insecurity and opportunism. Maybe such combinations were the composition of every choice, even his. It just depended on how well or poorly the insecurity was hidden from the active mind, or how easy it was to overlook, like in the case of the council, who'd made the exchange of favors the highest possible good for hundreds of years. He avoided thinking of his own insecurities. Spliff walked over to a large and ornately woven rug to examine the wood toys scattered across it. Just then his sister ascended with the baby on her hip. By or, Spliff thought, I should really know that thing's name. Haida was having trouble hiding the surprise and concern on her face. She asked him if he'd like anything to eat or drink. Spliff declined. He took the others to the market to take his mind off things, Haida said, giving context. She was too giving, Spliff feared. You ought to stay away from the market, Spliff said. They should be okay. Today, though. Out of his pocket, Spliff drew out the pamphlet and held it while she put the baby down in a small crib, and then gave the pamphlet to his sister. She read it slowly. Where did you get this? She finally asked, looking him in the eyes. He wanted to tell her the truth, finally have some intimacy with her. He realized this was the first time they'd been alone in 15 years, maybe longer. But he couldn't bring himself to burden her with information which would do her no good. He stuck to his story and said he'd found it. She invited him to sit with her in 2 wicker chairs in shade just short of the sun. She'd hung a variety of crystals against the outer mountain wall which reflected different colors in the sunlight. They sat in silence for a while. She seemed unconcerned about the pamphlet. They both started talking at the same time and then laughed. Spliff held out his palm and said she should go first. I wanted to say, or didn't, I didn't want any of this. What do you mean? Spliff asked. The house. I see how you look at the maids. How do I look at the maids? Like you're thinking about Mom. Well, I'm not. Should I be? Spliff asked again. I do. You shouldn't feel guilty. I didn't say I felt guilty. Sophia is a good friend. I just think about Mom. You know how unhappy she was. I guess I don't, Spliff admitted. I was in my own world. I mean, I knew she wasn't nice. She was exhausted, Haida said. I can understand that now. She missed you, in the end. I was born to be missed. Much better than getting the messy reality. Haida looked at him with concern as Spliff got more and more interested in the refracted light through the dangling crystals. I don't say this to be mean, but do you know how pompous that sounds? Like you're the only one who's allowed to be a mess? I didn't mean to be pompous, Spliff said. I know, Haida said with a big sigh. The most entitled gnome in the mountain doesn't mean to be entitled. It just happens as it happens. I try to remind myself of that. Spliff looked at his sister, seeing her for what felt like the first time. She'd had ethics all along. Why did he feel surprised? Why did you marry Keppo? Things happen. She stood to look over the baby. He's a good dad, but you shouldn't be here when he gets back. What did I do to him, other than give him everything? You don't see, in even what you just said? Spliff thought for a moment. My point is, he's crazy. I'm not doing anything to hurt him or you or the kids or anything. Haida started organizing toys into a small toy chest. But you are the end of a series of events. You're the end reaction in a chain of events. Gnomes are scared of ends. The end is the beginning of the beginning of the end, of the beginning, ending, beginning, in the end where it began. Spliff took an exaggerated breath. At the end, like beginning with beginning qualities, though really was an end of a beginning. Haida stared at him. Sorry, he apologized, but you see my point. Do you see mine? I'll admit, no, not really, Spliff said. You don't see how you might pose an existential threat? Look, what do I have to do? Put something in writing about how I don't want to hurt my own sister? By the way, I think there's bigger things to worry about. Spliff grabbed and held up the pamphlet lying on the small table between the chairs, waving it like an actor in a play demanding attention. There's been stuff like that since Felsior first got here. Nothing has ever happened, Haida said. What if it's different this time? What if I know it's different? Spliff said, exaggerating his intonation to imply a deeper knowledge without giving away too much. Why would you know? Spliff hedged. I don't know. I'm wondering if the council is prepared if something like this does actually happen. As soon as the humans were halfway up the incline, they'd shut the gates to the dome, and the Yomes would pick 'em off with crossbolts from their hovels. Why would the humans attack? Spliff had to concede. He didn't know what they were ultimately up to. But you know human mercenaries, it's not like they enjoy thinking. He sat back down in the wicker chair, Haida cooing at the fussy little one. She picked her up and sat down in the chair next to Spliff. Spliff looked at his sister with the babe. Loving always came easier for you. How do you mean? She asked. I don't know. It's not very hard. She looked down at the child lovingly. You'll know when you have one of your own. Spliff guffawed. Oh, you know what I mean, she chastised him. After a moment, Spliff responded, I can imagine some Yome being my entire world, but that Yome is me. All this changing and correcting, managing for love like how I manage myself, I don't think I was up for it. I always felt like I might suddenly catch on fire, and I didn't want to have to worry about anyone else when it happened. Oh, every Yome feels like that sometimes, Haida said. You think so? Spliff tried to put as much earnestness in his voice as possible. He did want to believe, but was held back by an idea of his uniqueness. He didn't believe the other gnomes felt it, not the way he did. The door to their living room suddenly opened and Keppo came in with a little gnome on each hip. Brother and sister turned in their chairs and both tried not to panic in their own ways. Haida stood, then Spliff stood. Spliff said, I was just leaving. Keppo called for the servant and asked her to bring in the cart he'd been pushing the children in. The little one squirmed out of his arms and bounded in zigzags over to their toy chest. Haida continued to say nothing. Spliff picked up the pamphlet, walked over, and handed it to Keppo. I thought this would be something to take to the council. Keppo read the words scornfully. He looked at Spliff with a sneer. So you want me to give this to the council and look like a fool? He handed back the pamphlet. Give it to them yourself. While you're at it, Keppo continued, why don't you take credit for every good thing which has happened to every gnome in Ionatta for the last decade? I'm sure they'll appreciate it deeply. Spliff didn't look back at his sister. He didn't want to implicate her. He left, taking a slight arc in his path, keeping Keppo in his peripheral vision as long as possible. Questions of Force 3. If Francis had thought the first hangover from that sprinkle of etherealmite hard to handle, it was now an irrelevant nuisance compared to the days-long anguish after drinking a vial. Popheme had been moderately prepared. She had her servant bring in pot after pot of herbal tea. They held each other on her bed, and then, when they became too sweaty or stiff, one would move to the couch or chaise lounge. After about 24 hours, Francis could think again. He would not have called the time he spent in agony without thought. Thoughts were consumed by the idea of pain, yet there was no specific pain. It was a great existential ache, which didn't allow him to focus on anything. Over a simple breakfast of airy puff pastry and rose butter, they could finally look at each other. Not well, or for long. The passion of the experience had truly been lost to time. Francis felt vaguely ashamed. Such a powerful experience, and yet so poorly remembered. What had he always meant when he spoke of time being the golden raindrops of his life? The person who said that phrase felt very far away. Or maybe it had been self-deceit. He'd spent most of his life trying to become something. Was becoming anti-time? To become had, in moments, made time feel more precious. But this last experience pointed out the absurdity in such thought. If such acts made time more precious, what was on the other side of becoming? Maybe there was no other side. Other than the brutal hangover, he had no sense of proof that together they had consummated a god. They were both addicted to the state of becoming. Now, more than anything, he was concerned how wrapped up he'd become with a crazy person, all because of his weakness for becoming. It had been an incredibly sexy argument. Normal child-rearing hadn't attracted him in the slightest, but being father to a god? Who could say no to that? Well, obviously many. It's not like she had been waiting around for him to show up. No one else had taken her up on the offer. She needed the right rube, with a hearty constitution. Francis had to give himself at least that much credit for his years in the wilderness. After complaining about his eyes hurting, taking a bite of pastry and rubbing his face, Francis asked, "So why me?" "Why you what?" Popheme answered, perfectly naive, crossing one leg over the other and taking a sip of tea. Francis tried not to become annoyed. "Why do this alchemy with me? If it was some big plan, you don't seem the type to leave things up to chance, and my being here is completely accidental." "Is it? An accident? Did you not choose to come here?" "That's not the point, and you know it." "It's kind of the point." Popheme wasn't trying to frustrate him intentionally, so she continued, with grace. "I knew the right person would come along eventually. You're right, it didn't have to be you, but I'm glad it was." "Do you understand the question I'm asking you?" "Not really, no," Popheme admitted. Francis had to think, which was hard. He rubbed his face again and played with his beard. "Have you tried this before?" "Ah, so it's a question of X's." Popheme smiled her big, arrogant smile. Francis was coming to love that smile. He loved the freedom of her smugness. He told her to forget it, smeared more rose butter on his pastry, and continued to not look at what would make him weak. What did a god do other than make everyone else irrelevant? What was one supposed to go on feeling, knowing a being controlled everything, contained everything? Some people were supposed to find it comforting, this idea that gods had some effect on the trajectory of one's life. Francis found no comfort in this idea. But what if he had some input on the god's actions? He could understand the appeal. Though overall he was confused, his visual process of the room would go swimmy every few minutes. "Let me ask you this," she began again. "Does light move?" "I don't know," Francis responded. Didn't feel like giving anything away. But the more he thought about it, the idea tickled his curiosity. "I feel heat on my face from the sun. Does fire move?" "Fire continues to need its wood. No, perhaps light is the same. All that ore, molded into thin string, is it not made up of individual little slivers? What do we do when we ignite the ethereumite? We start a reaction where all the little bits have to respond." "You know," Francis rubbed his face again, "I find all this talk very curious, but I can't piece together what this has to do with my question." "What I am suggesting is that maybe light is only a ripple and that it exudes on your face under the right conditions. The existence of light is a trigger moving all these little bits, so it gives the illusion of movement, but just as fire is a spark, so is light." Francis rubbed his forehead. "I've got to go back to my pack and grab a couple tinctures." Popheme sighed deeply. Yes, I think I'm going to lie back down. Francis stood and walked towards the door as she sat on the bed. He had to know, so he turned and asked, "Were you saying all of this was inevitable, like light?" "I think you already know the answer to that." Popheme laid down and placed a small pillow over her eyes and forehead. He'd always felt like he wanted to be understood, but being with this person made the inevitability seem cloying, even thinking the word inevitable for what felt like the 20th time in 2 days. It led his mind to thoughts of death, which yesterday had honestly seemed like a potential joy or release, and terrifying, of course. If death was a choice, it was the last choice, and what did that say about choices in general? Perhaps that's why death was terrifying. The end of choice, the end of illusion. And maybe choice was the illusion. Choice felt like the most important thing there was. Maybe that was just him. Maybe others cared far less about their choices. Francis could understand better than ever why one should avoid bad feeling at most cost. Still, all those pieces of life which happened in wandering, to try them all, it had felt like a choice. Had all of them been inevitable? "Bring me something wild for this headache, will you?" Popheme called from the bed as Francis left. Returning with some acceptable tonics, Francis was thinking to himself, if she had everything so planned out, how come she didn't have medicines for the hangover? He felt better thinking of her as fallible. As he exited the second part of the not-so-secret passage, he cracked open one of his favorite remedies, feeling an overwhelming sense of selfishness at the idea of sharing it. With his head tossed back and the liquid just reaching his stomach, he began to hear loud noises down the hall. A group of 6 or 7 human miners dressed in thin leather armor and carrying swords turned the corner quickly and hollered at him. The door was right behind him. Francis turned instinctively. One of them yelled even louder. As he reached for the door, he felt a pinch and thump in his right shoulder. The impact spun him slightly, and then as the vials dropped from his fingers, which seemed no longer able to clench, he noticed a numbness in his arm. Francis's legs became wobbly, and he sat on the ground. As the humans walked up to him with superior looks on their faces, a leader in the front, reloading a small crossbow, for some ungodly reason, the only thing Francis could think about, looking up at this ugly ragtag group, was a line from a book. Examined from this angle, it is not, in the literal sense, significant. Questions of force. 4. They came up the incline in small groups, so as not to attract attention. They knew the mining schedule for the gnomes, and went in between shift changes. A gnome guard at the main doors to the mountain was bribed with powerful possibilities, and 2 others were covertly assassinated. Once the full battalion had reached the entrance to the dome, the other humans came out from the shadows and pulled a tarp off a cart, revealing the weaponry and armor underneath. The 65 or so miners equipped themselves, ready for the day, a long time coming. Calumny led the battalion through the market. Vendors were just starting to open up shop. Calumny grabbed the first gnome he saw and held them gruffly by the shirt. He demanded to know where Falcior's mansion was. The rest of the goons spread out through the stalls, holding gnomes and human merchants hostage. An older male gnome refused the orders by one of the humans and was run through with a sword, the powerful thrust of a blade arm that badly wanted blood. The gnome Calumny had grasped was too frightened to talk, and he threw it aside. He grabbed another, and this time his demands were met. The gnome pointed him in the right direction. Calumny dropped the gnome to the brick streets and demanded he show them the way, while the other begrudged miners stole from the stalls and assaulted their way through the market. Calumny reminded them to grab oil, lanterns, and food. No happening such as this had taken place in Ionatta, and some residents who were awoken looked out their living holes but did not dare venture into the streets, unsure about resistance or where their efforts could be placed without putting them in mortal danger. The goons then robbed at will, and some were getting ideas in their heads about running off with the loot, but Calumny had kept them together this far with grand promises of lives they'd never even dreamed of. However, Their lack of quiet and finesse gave enough forewarning that by the time they were ready to breach Falsior's door, his guards had been able to barricade it with a crossbeam. Among the guards looking for an advantage was Grail, who, woken from his new bunk in the barracks, was desperate to know just what they were shutting out. His newest comrade was a mercenary named Hayden. Grail appreciated his bluntness. They'd stayed up together the last 3 nights discussing valor and its possibilities. Hayden had told him, "One's heart only beats so many times. Might as well make every beat count." Shared over mugs of beer, Grail had found this sentiment very profound. Rushing up to the doors looking for Hayden, Grail tripped hard on one of the corners of the glass sculpture of 3 stairs with a gnome napping in the middle, and it tipped over, cracked its first stair on the ground, which toppled the rest, cracking in many places as Grail cursed to himself and hopped around holding his bruised shin. A couple guards looked back at him, but then returned to scrambling and looking for objects to barricade the door with. Grail hobbled and finally caught up with Hayden. He yelled, asking who was attacking. Hayden didn't know either. Grail looked up the nearest set of stairs. "Up!" he called. Immediately Hayden knew what he was getting at, and they both went for the stairs to find an opening to look down from, Grail hopping after his new friend. The facade of the mansion had one large round hole. There was no reason for anyone to look out that way towards the street, so no piece of the upper landing was directly next to the hole. In fact, they found they couldn't see out from the stairs they had chosen, so they dashed down again to another set of stairs, which would take them up 2 landings where they could see down through the hole. Grail cursed his leg, which seemed to have gotten cut from the collision, as he could feel warm drippings through his pants. When he finally caught up with Hayden, he asked him what he could see, not looking himself as he was busy rolling up the bottom of his pants to assess the damage. "It's too many," Hayden said, a little tremolo in his voice, which Grail had never heard before. Looking for himself with renewed curiosity, Grail understood what Hayden meant. The street was nearly full with rowdy miners holding swords and breaking into groups to work on something on the ground. Suddenly Grail saw a torch ignite and a miner stand up with his homemade fire. Damn it all! He hadn't even gotten around to spending any of his small sack of silver on refurbishing his armor. Bounding and hobbling back down the stairs, the pair were excited to get to Falsior, but he was already near the doors conferring with his captain, the guard with the thin mustache. The doors received a crackling blow. A voice bellowed Falsior's name. "Open up or we'll have to burn you out." Grail wondered how easy it would be to catch a door on fire. Falsior instructed his guard to arm themselves and return to the door. Hayden helped Grail tie on his breastplate before putting on his own more nimble chainmail. Grail was the last to return to the group, chinking back with a limp in his full armor. They were lined up in formation behind Falsior, who instructed 2 of the guard to remove the braces from the door. Finally, Falsior gave them a nod, and they opened both doors simultaneously, revealing the large group of goons behind. They were outnumbered, that much was clear. Falsior's full guard numbered 14. Diplomacy would be key, but Falsior was confident. Talking was really the only thing he'd ever been good at. "Calumny, nice to see you again," Falsior said as he was approached by the big goon with a slight hunch and matted hair, the constellation-like pockmark scars white on his flushed face. "I trust you had no troubles finding the place?" Falsior tried to sound calm. "I wouldn't get smart. That time is over," Calumny growled. "Right." Falsior put his hands behind his back, putting his palm flat in a calming sign. "What would you like? Higher wages? Better food? I see now we've been neglecting you. This can all be fixed." Calumny called forward a few of his top men and ordered them to search the place. The look in his eyes was a resolved menace, and 5 paces away and not slowing, Grail couldn't simply stand by. He brandished his broadsword and clanged quickly up to Falsior's side. After he did this, the captain with the thin mustache did the same, almost ashamed, taking a fighting stance with his rapier on the other side. Calumny stopped. "None of you have to die." He pointed behind Falsior at the guards. "You're just like us. We'll split it all, evenly." And what exactly are we splitting, Callum? I think you might be under the misapprehension there's more gold here than there actually is. Calumny said nothing. Falcior was unnerved. He really hadn't seen this coming. What are you going to do exactly after killing me? It's not like the gnomes will just accept you as their new leader. You have me outnumbered, but you do not outnumber the gnomes. And worse yet, you don't know how to keep the lights on. You just know where to find the crystal. You'll have to get someone else to mine it for you, and then the whole facade will really crumble. Listen, you haven't thought this through. The sorceress knows how to run the machine. I don't need you. It was Falcior's turn to stay silent. Calumny knew more than he should. Why? How? Doesn't solve the problem with mining the theromite, Falcior said. Oh, don't you worry. We've got plenty. He'd held on with too loose a grip. It was no wonder kings became tyrants. If you weren't one, any fool could think they were you. The miners were restless standing behind Calumny. He could feel their energy but wanted to yet contain it. Hey, Calumny put on a chummy facade. I'm not unreasonable, but there have been sacrifices. Blood sacrifices. I'll tell you what. Bow. Bow? On a knee, then we'll see. Falcior was used to a bluff, but when the other player had all the cards, there was no reason to draw out a concession. He bent low, dipping down his head, letting his hair fall over his face. Calumny commanded the guard to throw down their arms. That's up to them. If you tell them what to do, you better be prepared to reward it, Falcior said. Grail thought it a touching, if uninspiring and rather pathetic way to de-escalate the situation. He'd always wanted to believe the liking of things. He always wanted to believe compensation was secondary. But maybe it was a long play. Falcior did know many things. If you tell us to, we'll do it, sir, Grail shouted, obtusely speaking for everyone. Falcior looked at him with bemused gratitude. Please. Grail dropped his broadsword with a resolute flare. Falcior asked Calumny, Now what? Calumny wasn't sure, because in the back of his mind, all he could think about was being with Popheme. Meanwhile, Spliff had fallen asleep in the communal living area above the connected apartments. He'd had anxious dreams and wanted to breathe less stilted air. He was easily awakened by all the noise of the miners coming up the street, and he went to the main door to see what was happening. He peeked out his head. A crowd was bunching at Falcior's main door, the door to the glass house. He didn't have much time. He'd known this was going to happen. Why didn't he make a plan? In any case, there was only one thing to do. Stop thinking and make a break for it. He crept out the door, hoping he wouldn't attract attention. He was down the steps and in the street before the first goon fixed their gaze on him. Immediately Spliff started running. The first zig out of the outer circle was not far, and if nothing else, he could find a good cranny to hide in. Thankfully, the goon didn't give chase. He turned back to the main attraction of the double doors to Falcior's. Spliff speed-walked through the streets. When he got to the market, he was taken aback by the destruction. A few of the mountain guard had arrived, had lain down their halberds and were attending to the wounded. Seeing a dead gnome merchant face down in a pool of blood was more shocking than Spliff had expected. He had seen death, but it was always old death. It seemed like most inhabitants were hiding in their homes. This was probably the right move. Instinctively, he went to a guard, asking what they were going to do. He looked into the guard's eyes and saw fear and youth. He asked if they had some kind of emergency signal or plan. At this, the guard got more resolute. They did. There were horns to blow in the center. In the center of the dome, they made the most sound. How many of the mountain guard existed? Spliff asked, knowing they were not trained for battle, but trained as peacekeepers. The guard answered there were 6 approximately, on shifts. Spliff said he would go down and get some miners and blacksmiths. They would come up and have the humans outnumbered. This put a hint of courage in the kid's eyes. Spliff stood and walked his way through the debris of the market. This was the realization of his worst fears. Now, the only thing left, clean up his mess. Chapter 2 Rebellions. There was a steady stream of gnomes entering and exiting Jemima's to return to the street, where a rebellion was forming and glasses of courage were being drunk. Gnomes were arming themselves with small crossbows and spears twice their height, spears which had ornate metal claws at the bottom of the reinforced wood, which was meant to be planted into the ground to absorb force if any human was foolish enough to charge. Some were simply carrying their mining equipment, which felt like extensions of their arms and could be wielded more nimbly than untrained weapons. Spliff had deferred to Tycho as leader of this rebellion. Although he had seemed a meek Yome at first, something in his blood had started burning. Spliff liked watching this revelation in other Yomes, and he thought back to the conversation with his sister not 2 days ago when he spoke about his fear of spontaneous fire. He was not so alone after all, had never been. He hoped his sister was all right. They were ready to climb. Jemima came out with a final round of crisp ciders for any who wanted, and the little army started marching. Tycho in the lead, with Spliff close by his side. Miniwuna was going too, though she found herself at the back of the pack. Tallest by far, she would have been an easy target. She wasn't entirely convinced this plan was thought through. Still, she had to see the events for herself, and if she got to crack one of those goons across the face with her whip, all the better. Back in the market, Spliff saw a grouping of 3 freshly killed gnome guards. There was much chattering in Yomish, this being the first time many of them had seen the damage to the market. Suddenly, an overturned barrel rose off the ground, and a few gnome rebels skittered with fear, but the jump scare faded as another gnome emerged. Spliff recognized him from one of the dinners with the counselors. He was a younger counselor who had been grandfathered in with generational wealth. He approached the little army blubbering. They'd taken his mother and killed his guard. Spliff talked to him as Tycho encouraged the ever-growing army forward, looking for survivors. The humans were taking gnome hostages. The young counselor wasn't sure why, confused about everything, but he was happy to finally see the resistance. Bolstered, the entitled gnome again found his machismo. He asked Spliff where his weapon was. It was the first time Spliff noticed he didn't have a weapon. How odd. What an essential detail to overlook. He'd never pictured himself fighting. He felt all the Yomes were a show of force, a negotiation tool. Still, rather silly to go on without any weapon. The younger counselor got excited. Come with me, I've got some great stuff. Spliff conferred briefly with Tycho. Perhaps they might arm more gnomes here in the dome. Spliff encouraged him to do what he thought best, and they'd meet up again shortly. Just don't start the war without me, Spliff joked. They took a series of zigzagging alleyways to a side door. The ragtag group of merchants and miners looked amusing as a gang, like a group of children on recess from the most egalitarian school in the world, following each other, almost giggling with an excess of energy and adrenaline, down 2 flights of stairs to a sub-basement. There were no lights from the residence, and the young counselor had to light 3 lamps kept by the door. They revealed a room full of old weapons. Spliff found himself gravitating towards a shiny silver hammer in the middle of the table. It had a curved pick on the back, like it was one of the very first mining tools before they were smithied in a standard way. The young counselor approached him. A fine choice. One of the oldest in the collection. I hope you will kill one of them with it. The story alone will increase the price tremendously. Spliff gave the young counselor a sidelong look. He was saying the quiet part out loud. Another piece of the event Spliff hadn't thought about. The story of it all. Looking around, watching the others pick out weapons, he was growing concerned they were all too wrapped up in the story. None seemed to be taking seriously the extent of the threat they were up against. This thought inspired him yet more to become a leader. He encouraged everyone to head back. The street was full of gnomes trying to peek over each other. They were bottlenecked in the narrow side street, the main approach to the outer ring in Falcior's mansion. Spliff was having trouble getting through the crowd, but he didn't stop or overthink. He held the hammer above his head and kept maneuvering, the gnomes parting for him. Getting closer, gnomes were sitting on the ground, and he was instructed to crouch. He passed several wounded gnomes getting slowly dragged back through the crowd, and a couple dead gnomes, one with a crossbolt through an eye. He scrambled forward on all fours to the front line of gnomes standing upright against the barrier constructed by the human miners. The barrier was made from random furniture in the mansion. Tycho was in the middle, conferring with the other gnomes around him. Spliff immediately asked what the plan was. "There's 3 barriers, this one and 2 more on the main road. I think we split up and start climbing over them at the same time. They'll get some of us, but we'll overtake them." "Have you tried negotiation?" Spliff asked. "I'm pretty sure they're not interested in negotiating." It was the late afternoon now, and soon the lights would turn on for the evening. Would they turn on? Spliff looked around, and since they were no longer in the marketplace, he couldn't tell if the twinkly ambiance lighting was working. He tried to retrace his steps in his mind, and realized when they'd gone down into the counselor's basement there had been no light. Spliff said out loud, to no one in particular, they should consider attacking in the dark. A plan hit him suddenly. "I know how to run the machine," Spliff said, looking directly at Tycho, but still forming the next words of the plan in his mind, getting the words out before anyone else could interrupt. "We'll wait until dark. I'll give you a heads up. 20 minutes before I turn it on again, the lights will come on and we'll catch them totally off guard." It was a hard plan to argue with. Tycho tasked the gnome standing nearby to spread the word. Spliff began to crawl back out through the crowd. Tycho called after him, and when Spliff turned to look, Tycho gave him a resolute nod, a thank you, to solidify the plan as a pact. It wasn't until after he'd grabbed Miniwuna and a couple of the stragglers from the back to act as his runners that Spliff fully realized what this plan was going to suggest. There was no magic. If he could turn on the lights, any gnome could. He was fundamentally ruining Falsior's plans. Fine, good, he thought to himself. This is the best way it could happen, saving the fake wizard's life. They came to the area of remembrance with the gray box on stilts. It was surrounded by human miners. They had clearly raided the vendors' stalls and were eating and drinking. There were at least a dozen of them. One of the miners on watch saw them come around the corner. He yelled, and Spliff turned tail and ran back around the corner, waving his arms for his compatriots to follow. Soon, they realized they were not being pursued. Spliff was stuck in indecision. "Isn't that the problem with plans?" Miniwuna said. "You always need another in the middle." "We need crossbows. A lot more crossbows." Spliff agreed. Maybe they could circle the miners. They went back and enlisted more gnomes, as many as they could find with crossbows. These were largely trade gnomes from the incline. They were not trained shots and not organized, but there were about 50 of them, and Spliff liked their chances. They came out of the alleys, crossbows raised. Their small stature didn't allow them to see around some of the larger monuments, and as they crept forward, no human miner was in sight. They'd formed no real plan or signaling mechanism. They walked forward in little pods. Spliff asked Miniwuna if she saw anything. Suddenly she did, as a foot slipped out behind a monument as a miner knelt to grab something. "You should go back to what you do best. Go hide in your holes. If you stay out here, you're gonna die," a human voice echoed loudly. The gnomes were cautious, feeling their size. Although scrappy, they stood no chance in a fight, all other aspects being equal. One human with an axe could chop off 3 gnome heads with a single blow. It was easy now to imagine the worst, which is to say, the gnomes were not eager to rush in. The light was beginning to fade. The gnomes had a tiny advantage in the dark. All mining tunnels were consistently dimly lit, and gnome vision had improved perception of shadows, but this was a nearly pointless advantage, one which would be useless in a head-on rush. "We have you surrounded," Spliff tried, hiding the desperation in his voice. It felt like a deadlock. Min leaned down and commented to Spliff she could hear the humans scuffling around. "Last chance," the human voice yelled nasally. Then, in the half-light, the gnomes saw objects hurled outward from the circle. They made a hissing sound as they flew through the air. One gnome lowered his crossbow curiously and looked down at the hissing little cylinder, which reminded him of a decorative container his mom had kept her earrings, which then exploded in a flash, thousands of tiny metal pieces tearing through his torso, ripping veins and ligaments alike. The other cylinders exploded at the same time, and many gnomes screeched in pain, getting clipped by shrapnel. The humans gave throaty war whoops from behind their cover. A few took advantage of the chaos to move into the open and fire a shot from a crossbow. One gnome with steel nerves managed to stand their ground and fire a bolt, and the miner collapsed backwards with a punctured lung. Spliff was thinking very practically. How many of those little containers could they have made? He reflected on the process of making one himself, and how could they have gotten the recipe? He doubted they were skilled enough to know how to make them. Someone had made the cylinders for them. It was a scare tactic, and one which, seemingly, paradoxically, summoned his courage. Spliff stood and raised his hammer over his head and rushed forward down a path, determined to strike the pointy end of his hammer straight through the first appendage he saw. His charge inspired many to follow. There was scrambling from the humans, and a few more canisters were thrown, but this time they went sailing over the charging gnomes' heads, only a few hesitant gnomes at the back catching deadly shrapnel. Behind a monument, Spliff saw long shadows in the fading light of a group of 3 miners, and he swung fiercely at one of their calf muscles. Miniwuna, close on his tail, took aim with her whip and slashed at their faces. Both blows landed on the same unfortunate human, who was simultaneously crumpled by the hammer blow, then strangled by the whip, its snake-like tongue smacking onto his vulnerable neck, squeezing a rush of blood up into his brain and causing a series of capillaries to explode. More gnomes rushed forward and fired their crossbows at point-blank range upwards into the nearest human chest. The last human standing near Spliff lunged downward at him with a sword. Miniwuna jerked the body of the human she still had by the neck, pulling it over Spliff's body and acting as a human shield, which took the full pierce of the blade as Spliff was pinned to the ground and squirmed breathlessly underneath. Miniwuna flicked her wrist and released her whip from the now-dead human's neck. She whipped the goon's arm, which was still trying to pull his sword from the body of his comrade. She pulled him forward, and he tripped, pushing his own weight into the sword, which went through the other miner entirely and clinked into the paving stone inches from Spliff's torso. She withdrew her dagger and stuck it fiercely and repeatedly into the goon's back, until Spliff managed to wheeze at her to stop and help him up, the 2 bodies crushing his small frame. The humans were outnumbered and down to their last 7 men. They gave up completely, throwing down their arms. Spliff's adrenaline was spiked, and he felt like he could see very clearly, but everything had a blur. They all stood looking at the humans for a minute. One of the gnomes who'd lost his best friend to one of the explosion devices reloaded his crossbow and shot one of the humans in the stomach. Spliff raised his hammer and yelled words of slowing, putting his body in front of the humans facing the other gnomes. He reminded them the humans had hostages. They would need hostages. He told the humans to sit down, and they did, and the power he felt in that moment was very strange. The whole world was just words, uttered in the right circumstance, where compliance wasn't an option. The gut-shot human writhed pitifully. About this kind of thing Spliff didn't know what to do. So he ignored the groans and continued with the mission. He waved over Miniwuna, and they headed towards the box. They stopped as they heard a clatter coming from inside the box. The sounds were not loud. Spliff called back to ask the humans if any of them had hidden inside. The humans responded no. They were probably lying. Miniwuna went forward, confident in her extrasensory hearing. Creeping up the wooden stairs, Spliff brandished his hammer, and Min wiped the blood off her dagger onto her pants leg, whip in her other hand. The steps creaked, and they took them as slowly as possible, but the steps groaned with each footfall. At the top of the stairs, Miniwuna shrugged shyly. She hadn't heard anything else. Spliff waited next to the door. He knew he couldn't stay there, thinking he'd wind up talking himself out of whatever needed to be done. He pushed open the door with his shoulder, the hammer cocked back in his free hand, Min close behind. He couldn't immediately see anyone. The only light was what was coming through the door. He'd been here with Popheme when he'd insisted lectures and diagrams on paper weren't sufficient. It was a room not meant for occupation. The operator was encouraged to step out once mechanisms got moving. The gears were numinous. 6 separate stations fed into one large gear in the middle, which then branched off into hundreds of littler gears surrounding it. The first time he'd seen it, Spliff had marveled how they'd been able to keep the purpose of its construction secret. Spliff crept towards the middle, which was a hollow box with many smaller gears and condensing crystals. Through small gaps in the workings, he could distinguish an unnatural shadow. He motioned them in, and they charged around. A defenseless cry spluttered from a gnomish throat. When the voice heard Spliff's voice, there was another cry of relief. The voice sputtered apologies as it lit an oil lamp. It was his old boss, Toppler, and another young gnome cowering behind. "Did you help them?" Seeing Toppler's cower in apologies, Spliff immediately realized he needed to take a couple breaths. After the shock came relief, and Toppler explained he'd always been curious to get a look inside. Spliff started looking around. He found the crate in the corner. He opened the lid to reveal the refined ore inside. It had a very fine consistency, sand-like. It was kept in glass tubes stacked vertically between thin wood separators. There were only 5 tubes left. He could split the ore into 6 different amounts to run each station, but he wasn't sure how long this would make the light last. Enough for a surprise attack, probably. "And what's those?" Toppler asked inquisitively over Spliff's shoulder, looking into the crate, already accepting his reduced position as pupil. Maybe his rejection of Spliff's ideas had been fear at not understanding, fear of being overtaken because he knew, deep down, he was not as intelligent as his station proclaimed. Spliff felt grateful, especially in this situation where time was of the essence, that he didn't have to deal with Toppler's ego. Spliff stood up and tried explaining as best he could. He went to one of the 6 stations, took out the metal clamshell, which the theramite was supposed to be sprinkled into. "Equal parts from all of these tubes into each of these," Spliff instructed. Toppler's hands were shaking, so he instructed the younger gnome on the task. Spliff got the remaining 5 clamshells from the 5 other stations. After all had been filled, he showed them how to insert the clamshells upright and pull down the magnetic needle so it was barely touching the top. They closed the clamshells in their cast-iron stove doors, and all was ready. It was not yet dark. He was ahead of schedule. Spliff wondered aloud if he might convince Toppler to do the last procedures. He showed them the cranks on each station. The cranking mechanisms were designed for a human, but with a little jumping effort could be started by a gnome. He explained how all needed to be spinning. At this point, perhaps they should wait until an hour after dark, to better disseminate the plan. Spliff took a minute to compose himself. His heart was beating fast, and he had a few moments to double-check if his mind was working clearly. He sat on the wooden steps and looked over the remembrance of the dead. He'd like to wander through this place. He tried to recapture that calm state of mind, thinking about the grand things like the fleeting nature of life, but his mind was too restless. What if they needed more time, more light? Where would more crates of theramite be? In the mines? Was that a better use of his knowledge than running back to the fight? Min sat one step below him, and he asked her, "Did you ever hear what they were doing with it? The crystals?" She said she didn't know. Her insides felt like 3 pigeons fighting over the same crust of bread. Spliff knew he would have to choose soon. A familiar feeling was coming on, a feeling like he'd had the first time he left Ionatta, but it was different now. He understood it differently. Had it always been guilt? Guilt that he wasn't enough, that he wasn't doing enough? Guilt about not knowing what was right? Maybe guilt was a disease the same way pregnancy was a disease. It was discomfort before the birth of a new reality. In this case, his new reality would be as a leader. This was all his mess, and he was going to clean it up. He'd strip Falsior of his title, replace him as the true discoverer of a theramite. Spliff even felt a little sympathy for these human miners, being forced as slaves to a lie. He looked over them sitting in the dirt and wondered if there might be a better way to recruit their angst. The other gnomes were doing their best to look tough, stand over the humans with weapons raised and bully them with words. Spliff went over and looked each human individually in the eye, asked them their names. He then asked the humans where they got the containers which exploded. One of the humans admitted to making them himself, his tone both slightly sheepish and proud. "And how did you figure out how to do that?" Spliff asked, really hoping they'd somehow stumbled into it themselves. A conspiracy from the top would only strengthen his position, and he was afraid of his new position getting any stronger than it already was. The human responded that they were given written instructions. Spliff looked over at Miniwuna. They were both thinking the same thing. They needed to warn Tycho about this new weapon. And who had given them the instructions? Falcior seemed like he would have no reason. Maybe it was Keppo. Keppo got the idea that the rebellion would make Spliff look bad. He could pin the whole thing on Spliff. He invited Min back towards the steps to confer quietly about what she'd like to do. She sat on the steps to be the same level as he. "Do you think there's any way to use these humans? Like as shields?" "Now there's a thought. I was thinking allies," Spliff said. "These Funturaf," Min huffed angrily. "They only know how to look out for themselves." "Well, maybe we could use that. Be better off getting rid of them," Min said. Being a leader was going to be tough. All these competing motives and opinions. He was going to have to make some decisions that wouldn't be liked, and he barely even knew what those decisions were. All right, he'd take them to the front, like she said. Maybe he'd have a better idea on the way.